Okay, so now we're going to talk about the endocrine system. If you had lab on Tuesday, then we already started talking about endocrine rules. But today we're talking about specific glands and their endocrine functions. So whether you had lab or not already, it doesn't matter. We're going into specific glands and functions now. So the first gland in the brain, and this is central endocrinology, which means where are we referring to? In the brain. Yeah, so central endocrinology is talking about the glands in the brain that are releasing hormones. And the first one's the pineal gland, and this one actually has like the most mystery around it because hundreds of years ago they were trying to figure out what the heck this little thing that's the size of a pea does, and they couldn't figure it out. Rene Descartes, the guy who said I think therefore I am, thought it was the connection between the soul and the human body. So if something happened to your pineal gland, your soul floated off into heaven and you went to hell. But we still have a lot of mystery around it. The one thing we do know for sure that you have to know is that the hormone that's released there is called melatonin, and most of you have probably heard of melatonin. It helps regulate what? Sleep. Yeah, you can buy artificial melatonin in a drugstore to help you regulate sleep, like when you have jet lag, when you travel across the country and the daylight cycles are different. It helps you to sleep better. So pineal gland helps regulate your sleep, basically, your circadian 24-hour rhythms, your diurnal cycles. Circadian and diurnal are actually two different cycles. One's daylight and circadian is 24 hours. Right. Next, a section of this, or a pathway going to this, goes right through something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it tells you where it is. Super means what? Above something. Chiasmatic. Where's it referring to in the brain? What's the chiasm? It's for sight, right? The optic chiasm, the X where it crosses over, X for chi, the Greek letter chi. The optic chiasm is this area for where your visual pathways go, but the suprachiasmatic nucleus is this little area of cell bodies right above that intersection. What's kind of interesting is that how it works, I should have a picture here. You see light. Light activates these neurons that send electricity through the pathway, right? They go through the optic chiasm, and this nuclei, this area of cell bodies, actually detects activity. So the more light you see, the more active the suprachiasmatic nucleus gets. The more active it is, it shuts off or inhibits the pineal gland. So in other words, when there's a lot of light out, it stops the pineal gland from making what chemical? Melatonin. But when there's not very much light, you lose that inhibition. So if you lose inhibition, it's the same as saying that now the area is excited. So it gets darker, less firing of these neurons, so you're in a dark room, you're not seeing anything, there's nothing firing. This pathway starts turning on, and it tells the pineal gland, make melatonin. So the darker the environment, the less firing in the eyes, the more melatonin's made. Does that make sense? So the more dark environment you're exposed to, the more melatonin's made. What they've actually found is that natural light versus things like fluorescent bulbs don't activate the visual centers the way that natural light does. So it actually works a little bit differently whether you're exposed to natural light or fluorescent light. Where did I skip? Oh. All right, so anyway, the pineal gland, we also refer to them as clot proteins. It's almost like every time you make another one, it's almost like putting another second into your sleep cycle. And it helps us sync our environment with our sleep cycles. All right, other roles of melatonin, so it's not just for sleep. It does help with sleep, but it also works as a natural contraceptive. I've had this like worst brain farts this week, and I can't remember certain words. Maybe I'm stroking slowly. But anyway, it's a natural contraceptive. And this is kind of an interesting reason is because when you get more melatonin in your system, what time of year is it usually when you have higher levels of melatonin? During the summer or during the winter? During the winter, because during the summertime there's lots of light, but during the winter it's a lot more darkness. So what they find is that reproductive cycles actually change in the wintertime, and they think it's because of melatonin. Why would you, if you were living outside, why would you not want to have babies in the middle of winter? Right, because they're going to die. So they just think this is an evolutionary process that higher levels of melatonin help turn down the reproductive cycles. I wouldn't go out and buy a bunch of melatonin and hope that is a good contraceptive, by the way. Just saying. How is it possible I'm pregnant? He said in class it was a natural contraceptive. I've been eating a bottle a day and sleeping like crazy. All right, so anyway, it triggers natural breeding, migration, hibernation instincts in animals because of the levels. An antioxidant, it slows down free radicals in your body. Free radicals are associated with aging, so it actually slows aging. It slows the aging of your body. And you know that because what kind of sleep did they tell you to get? Beauty sleep, yep, so it keeps you looking young. And then it also turns up immunity. The same thing when you're feeling sick, they tell you to get more sleep And what happens is melatonin comes out, and melatonin actually increases the activity of B and T cells. So it has a lot of functions besides just making you sleep. Right. Next gland is the hypothalamus, and of course you already know the hypothalamus is there for freezing, feeding, fighting, fornicating. And a lot of those processes are actually regulated by hormones. So when you're looking at the brain, remember, in this area we call the, what was that called? It started with a D. This area of the brain is called the diencephalon. Yep. So you have the diencephalon here, and all these parts have what word in common? You have the epithalamus, you have the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus. So all of these areas through here in the diencephalon are related to the thalamus. The hypothalamus helps regulate hormones for freezing, feeding, fighting, and fornicating. But what's interesting about it is it does it through another gland called the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus will actually make some hormones and stores them in the back pituitary, which is the posterior pituitary. And it also makes hormones that it releases into the blood that controls other hormones that are already made in the anterior pituitary. And I'll go through each of these in better detail. But the hypothalamus actually controls the pituitary. There's nothing the pituitary does that isn't controlled by the hypothalamus, which I always think is interesting. Your book calls the pituitary the master gland, the master endocrine gland. But in reality, you can't do anything without the control of the hypothalamus. So, to me, this is actually the master gland because it's controlling everything that happens in the pituitary. I won't put a question on a test saying which is the master gland. But just think of it this way, is that even though they call this the master gland, in reality it does nothing without being told what to do by the hypothalamus. Alright, so we'll talk about the hypophysis first, the pituitary. And you can split this into two parts. They call one side of it the adenohypophysis and the other one the neurohypophysis. Adeno, if you know any terms about epithelium, is actually epithelial tissue. It's a sheet-like tissue. So the adenohypophysis is actually an endocrine tissue that's made from epithelium. The neurohypophysis is made out of what? Neurons. Yep. So the pituitary we're going to split in half. And the first one, the adenohypophysis, is the anterior side. So where's that? Towards the back or the front? It's the front one. Yep. So the anterior one, where it develops from, if you remember your embryology, it develops from something called Rathke's pouch, which is actually part of the roof of the mouth. So it develops from the roof of the mouth and goes up and into your brain. It actually penetrates up and goes in. It's epithelial tissue, just like the skin of the roof of the mouth, it goes up and in. And when it invaginates, it actually causes this little endocrine pit. Right, the pathway that connects it to the hypothalamus is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Portal is telling you it's a bloodway. So it's a blood pathway that connects the brain to this. Remember, the brain is neurotissue. Rathke's pouch is epithelial tissue. When they get close to each other, they just kind of merge together, and they're connected by blood now. So anything that tells the anterior pituitary what to do that comes from the hypothalamus goes through this portal system. Hypothalamo, meaning hypothalamus, hypophyseal is talking about down below. And this is what it looks like. So here's your hypothalamus again. You have neurons up here in the hypothalamus that are developing these hormones. Right now they're actually neurotransmitters because they're made in a neuron. But what makes it a hormone? The second that it's released into the blood. Yep. So if it were released from one neuron to another, it's a neurotransmitter. Once it gets dumped into the blood, we call it a neurohormone, or just a hormone in general. So it travels down that hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. It's a blood stalk, basically. Blood drips down through this, goes into the anterior pituitary, and then it finds receptors on the target cells. Every time a hormone works, it only works if it binds to a receptor. It's just like a neurotransmitter. They only work if they're binding to a receptor. So this hormone comes down through the blood and binds to a receptor down here in the anterior pituitary. That cell has a bunch of hormones stored up in it. It's just sitting there waiting. So the anterior pituitary has all these hormones stored. As soon as they're stimulated by this hypothalamic hormone, that cell starts dumping its hormone out into the environment. So it's kind of like a balloon full of hormones. When it gets punctured or touched by this hormone, it releases everything on the inside out into the blood. And then this bloodway goes to everywhere in the body. So it circulates everywhere. It's how hormones typically circulate. By the way, these hormones, do you think every one of them stay in the anterior pituitary? No, they travel through too. It's almost, when you look at the way the endocrine system works, it's almost like when you go to the carnival and they have those little ducks that are floating in the water going around. Does anybody not know what I'm talking about? Good, your parents did love you. Happy for you. So you've got this little path of ducts that go around, and you can pluck one out, but the rest of the ducts just keep traveling by. That's exactly how hormones work in the blood. Not every hormone gets used. They get dumped into the blood, and you hope that they start getting used. So some of them will bind to a receptor, and the others go down through the rest of the circulation. They may bind to a receptor somewhere else in the body. They may go to the liver, and what do you think might happen to it in the liver? What's the liver notorious for? Cleaning up toxins, waste products, things in the body. So these are just like drugs. Anytime you learn something about a hormone, you know that rule also applies to a drug. So if drugs get cleared in the liver and the kidney, where do your hormones get cleared? Liver and the kidney. Yep. Another thing that can happen is once this hormone binds here, it can actually stick to the receptor, and that cell destroys it. So it doesn't get a chance to work 2 times. Right? So again, not every hormone actually works. A lot of them will circulate through the system, never finding a receptor and then getting destroyed in the liver or the kidney. Right? The posterior pituitary is connected by neurons. This is not a blood pathway. Here's your cell body of a neuron. It sends all, what's this long stalk of a neuron called? Here's the cell body, here's the terminal, it's the axon. Yep. So these hormones or neurotransmitters are actually made up here in the cell body. They're transported all the way down the axon, and then they're stored here in the terminal knob, or the terminal ending, in the posterior pituitary. They're just stored here. And this is the key. They're made in the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary actually doesn't make anything. It's just a storage site. The anterior pituitary does make its own hormones, but it doesn't release the hormones without being told to do so by the hypothalamus. So those are the 2 parts of the pituitary, and they have actually very significant characteristics, but very different characteristics at the same time. Okay, so when the hypothalamus wants to release this, it just dumps it into a bloodstream inside the posterior pituitary and then travels off to the rest of the body, just like a hormone. What's interesting is there are actually 6 hormones we're going to talk about in the anterior pituitary. There are only 2 that we're going to talk about in the posterior pituitary, and I'm almost positive you've heard of both of these. One's called vasopressin. What's its other name? ADH. Yeah, you learned about vasopressin ADH just like last week and the week before. It's made here in the hypothalamus. When is it released? What causes vasopressin to be released? If you don't remember, ask yourself, what does it do? What does vasopressin do? Makes you do what with water? Lose it or retain it? It's called antidiuretic, so it makes you do what? Retain it. So why would you release it in the first place? When your body is low in water or low in blood volume or blood pressure, because blood volume affects pressure. So you already know this pathway, why vasopressin works. The other one's oxytocin. So oxytocin, anybody not heard of oxytocin? Okay. When do you usually hear about oxytocin? Childbirth. Yeah, labor. So these are the 2 major hormones released by the posterior pituitary, but both of them are made in the hypothalamus. So the paraventricular nucleus means the cell bodies are releasing oxytocin. The only trick to remembering what it is the O and P are right next to each other in the alphabet. Right. The next ones are the supraoptic nuclei or nucleus. Those release vasopressin. Those 2 letters aren't anywhere near each other. I don't have any other tricks to help you remember, but oxytocin is released by the paraventricular cells and vasopressin by the supraoptic cells. Okay, so if I were to ask you a question about how is the anterior pituitary controlled by the hypothalamus, would you say by neurons or by blood? By blood. How would you say the posterior is controlled by the hypothalamus? By neurons, by axons that come down into it. Which one actually makes its own hormones, the anterior or posterior pituitary? The anterior. Where are the posterior pituitary hormones made? In the hypothalamus. Yep. So here are the anterior pituitary hormones you have to know, and I rearranged them so that they made their own little acronym. And this is what the acronym is. What is that? It's a flat pig. Right? So that's the best I could do. So the first one's follicle-stimulating hormone. This stimulates follicles in the gonads. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. Its job is to stimulate follicles in the gonads. And the follicles produce or release the actual reproductive cell. What's the name of the reproductive cell in a woman? It starts with an O. It's an ova, or what's the layperson term for it? An egg. Right? So the follicles actually stimulate the release of or development of an ova or an egg in a woman. So what must it release in a man? Sperm. Yep. So it helps produce and release sperm. Next hormone is luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone actually develops testosterone in a male. So what do you think it helps develop in a woman? Estrogen. Yep. It also is really important because it causes ovulation in a woman. And when we get to reproductive next week, we'll actually talk about this hormone a lot. A lot of people think, oh, it's estrogen that causes ovulation. It's not. It's actually just this hormone that does it. A spike in luteinizing hormone causes that little whoop, release of an egg. So both of these we call the gonadotropin hormones because they stimulate or they activate what? Think of the name, gonadotropin. The gonads, yep. They nurture and develop the gonads. Tropin or trophic means to nurture something. So gonadotropins nurture the gonads. Next, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This tells you where it works and what it causes to be released. Tropic means nurturing, remember? So it's going to nurture a part of the body. Adrenocortico. What do you think it's nurturing? Adrenocortico. What organ should pop in your mind when you hear adreno? Not specifically the kidneys, but the adrenal glands right above the kidneys. In fact, what part of the adrenal gland? The medulla or the cortex? Cortex. Where is that? Is that in the center or the outer part? Outer part. So it's telling you that this hormone is going to the outer part of the adrenal gland, the cortex, and releasing a hormone out there. And that hormone, well, the major hormone is going to be cortisol. It's a stress hormone. Most of the hormones that come from the adrenal cortex help you regulate stress or sex or water. They all just synonymous, sex, water, and stress. One causes another, I guess. Not funny, sorry. Thyroid stimulating hormone, give you a shiny nickel if you can tell me what that stimulates. Right, it tells you exactly where it goes. So here are the little abbreviations for each of them, but don't memorize just the abbreviations. Memorize the name because the name tells you what they do. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the gonad follicles. Luteinizing hormone actually develops the sex hormones. Adrenocortico goes to the adrenal cortex and releases the primarily stress hormones. And thyroid-stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid and releases what hormones? Thyroid hormones. T3 and T4. They help you regulate things like metabolism. They increase metabolism. They help you regulate calorie burning. They help you regulate body temperature. They help regulate growth. Thyroid hormones are super important. They actually do a lot more than we give them credit for. Right? Prolactin. Prolactin helps produce milk. So it helps with breast development and milk production. Not milk release, just milk production. Oxytocin actually causes milk release. So if a woman makes a lot of prolactin but no oxytocin, what's that term for? Where she makes milk but can't release it. She becomes engorged, right? And then the last one, growth hormone. Growth hormone is kind of a gimme. What's it make you do? Grow. Yeah, it stimulates soft tissues like muscles and bones to start growing. Helps develop joints and cartilage. So those are the 6 major hormones that come from the anterior pituitary. So F, L, A, T, and then PG, pig. Close enough. Oops, I forgot to say something. So anyway, all of the hormones I've listed so far are made out of proteins and peptides. So think about this. Proteins and peptides, are they going to easily cleared by the kidney? Will they be easy to pee out? Proteins and peptides. No, why? Because the glomerulus doesn't allow proteins to get through. So they're not going to easily be cleared by the kidney. So what's going to clear most of these hormones? The liver. Yep. Proteins and peptides, do they like water or dislike water? They love water. Are they going to travel easily through your blood? Absolutely. All these hormones travel easily through your blood. They work very quickly. Okay, so which one of the following would be true about the anterior pituitary hormones? I forgot another one. You may have had to have lab to understand this completely, so I'll walk through them. So the first one, are they hydrophobic? You know this already because I just explained it with you. What's hydrophobic mean? Phobic means it's afraid of water. It means it doesn't like water. So peptides and proteins love water. They're definitely not hydrophobic. What kind of chemical will be hydrophobic? Things that are fatty, lipidy, yep, like steroids that are made of cholesterol. Right, number 2, are they made as a big molecule, so are they made as a big chain of things, or are they made as like a single component, like an amino acid or anything? They're made of a big chain, so they're actually made as a bigger molecule. That was the answer. Synthesized on demand. What did I already tell you? I actually told you back here. What do you know about all these hormones? They're stored, right? They're already stored. So they're not made on demand. They're stored particles that are released when they're told to be released. Number 3 is not true. And then, number 4. Can they be stored? Yes, they can be stored. So this one's wrong. Saying they cannot be stored is incorrect. So number 2 is our right answer. So synthesized on demand was the only one I forgot to specifically say. All right, you should get used to drawing pathways. If you were to go out and buy a note card set or a study guide set for the endocrine system, it'd come with a pack of note cards or things that you could rip out for note cards that show you flow charts. The best way to design or remember these is design your own little flow chart to help explain what it does. What kind of feedback loop are almost all these things going to be controlled by? Negative feedback loop. So if the final response is to increase metabolic rate, what might be an initiating stimuli? Low metabolic rate. Yep. How about if a final stimuli might be to raise your body temperature? What might be an initiating stimuli? Having a low body temperature. So some of those just easily plug in. A lot of times there are little exceptions to the rules where there's something else that's not controlled by negative feedback and you don't have to memorize it, but in general, your gut should want to go straight to negative feedback loops, and that should help you understand the pathway. So the hypothalamus is actually controlling all of these. Remember, the anterior pituitary hormones, all of them are released because of something in the hypothalamus happening. So the hypothalamus releases a hormone that comes down here. We'll take TSH as an example. This one actually releases something called thyrotropic releasing hormone. It goes down how? By a neuron or by blood to the anterior pituitary? By blood. And then it activates the cell by binding to a what? A receptor. Once that receptor is activated, it dumps out thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland and tells the thyroid gland to turn on and release T3 and T4. They're called the whats? Thyroid hormones. Yep. And then they increase metabolic rate, increase body temperature, and other things that we'll talk about later. So once you release a lot of T3 and T4, what do you think the hypothalamus thinks? Now there's too much, shut off. So it shuts off this loop. Right? ACTH, and I'll actually show you in the next list of hypothalamic hormones how each of these come into play, but ACTH is the same way. Anything that's in the anterior pituitary is told what to do by what gland? The hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus releases a hormone. That hormone comes down here, it's called CRH. CRH comes down here and activates ACTH. ACTH goes down to the adrenal cortex, releases cortisol, and helps you deal with stress. So why does this thing come out in the first place? If it helps you deal with stress, because you are in a stressful situation. Yep. So high stress turns on the hypothalamus. This pathway turns on, releases cortisol, spikes your blood sugars, spikes your blood amino acids, spikes your blood fats, raises your blood pressure to try and get blood and nutrients to the brain to help you do what? Think quickly and get out of that stressful situation. Once you're out of the stressful situation, this whole pathway shuts off again. And then prolactin. There's actually prolactin releasing hormone and prolactin inhibiting hormone that comes from the hypothalamus that tell prolactin whether to be shut off or turned on. Prolactin goes to the mammary glands, develops breast tissue, and also milk production. This is wrong. This came right from the book, but it doesn't actually cause milk secretion. It causes milk production. What's the name of the hormone that causes milk secretion? Oxytocin. Yep. Oxytocin causes contractions. Oxytocin causes milk release. We'll talk about oxytocin a lot in just a bit. And then growth hormone. Growth hormone is a little bit more complex. Hypothalamus releases a hormone called growth hormone releasing or growth hormone inhibiting hormone to tell growth hormone what to do. It comes down to the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone is released. It goes everywhere in the body, and it affects things like soft tissues. It increases metabolism to help them grow and build, like bones and muscles, joints. It also goes to the liver and releases a second hormone. That second hormone is called the somatomedin, which mediates the body growth. It helps growth hormone. It's like growth hormone can't do it all on its own, so it asks for help by the somatomedins. Somatomedins come out. They also go to the bone and the soft tissues, and they increase bone growth. What stage in life do you think would spike your growth hormone? Puberty. Yeah, so it's not always a negative feedback loop. A lot of times it has to do with stages of life. Also sleep. Sleep increases growth hormone. So there's one of the exceptions to the negative feedback loop. And then LH and FSH, where did I say these went? To the gonads. They're called the gonadotropins. So you actually have a hormone in the hypothalamus that releases something called gonadotropin-releasing hormone. It comes down to the anti-pituitary, and it releases both at the same time. You release both, LH and FSH at the same time. They go to the gonads, which are the ovaries in women, the testis in male. And then LH increases testosterone or estrogen production, and FSH increases what production? Sperm or development of the egg. Right, so all those hormones that I just mentioned that came from the hypothalamus are all listed here. If you were putting a pathway together, you might isolate just the hypothalamus, the pathway coming down to the anterior pituitary, and then down to its target organ. So up here, the hypothalamus, which hormone in that list do you think would stimulate the release of LH and FSH? Whoops, wrong way. Yep, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. It tells you exactly what it does. It releases the two gonadotropins, LH and FSH. And I'll just breeze through this just to tell you how common sense it seems. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. What do you think it does to the anterior pituitary? It releases what hormone? Thyroid stimulating hormone. Yep. So thyrotropin releasing hormone releases thyroid stimulating hormone that goes to the thyroid gland. Corticotropin. Which in that list of anterior pituitaries does that one look like? Adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? So it looks just like it. This comes from the hypothalamus and goes to the anterior pituitary and releases ACTH. And then the ACTH goes to the adrenal cortex and releases what hormone? Adrenal cortex stress hormone. Cortisol. Yep, and that's even in the name. Look, cortico, so it looks like cortisol to help you remember. Even adrenocortico looks like cortisol again. So it's the pathways. You just have to get used to the pathways. Know it stimulates the pathway, know all of the hormones and glands involved, and then the final physiological effect of each pathway. Like just picking out that corticotropin again. What caused the release of this from the hypothalamus? If you don't remember, what's the final hormone that's released? Cortisol, that helps you deal with stress. So what happened to the hypothalamus that would stimulate this release? Stress. High stress, corticotropin releasing hormone comes out and goes to the what gland? Anterior pituitary. At the anterior pituitary, it releases a second hormone called what? Look at your list of anterior pituitary hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone that goes to the what gland? Adrenal gland. What part of the adrenal gland? The cortex, and releases what hormone? Cortisol, that does what? Helps you deal with stress. Yep, it spikes your blood sugars, spikes your blood fat, spikes all the nutrients in your blood so your brain can think quickly and get out of that bad situation, which shuts off the stretch, which turns off that feedback loop. So you can either memorize every single thing or make it make sense to you. Make a pathway out of it. Whatever starts the pathway, the very final product should usually do what? Shut it off. Unless it's a positive feedback loop, then whatever turns on the pathway, the final effect does what? Turns it higher. What hormone do you think we're going to talk about that's in a positive feedback loop? Oxytocin. Yep. A uterine contraction causes the hypothalamus to release oxytocin. Oxytocin causes more uterine contractions. So they get more intense, they get more frequent, and more powerful. All up until one traumatic event happens. And you know what that is. All right, and then I already said gonadotropin releasing hormones release the gonadotropin hormones, which are LH and FSH. Growth hormone releasing and growth hormone inhibiting. So they tell you exactly what they do. Prolactin releasing, prolactin inhibiting. Oh, by the way, growth hormone inhibiting hormone has a second name. This hormone stops all body growth. What's the name of a hormone you know of that stops everything in the body? Somatostatin. The other name for GHIH is somatostatin. It's literally telling you body stopping. Somato, body, stopping, stat. And then prolactin releasing and prolactin inhibiting. Prolactin inhibiting hormone actually has another name too. It's called dopamine, which also affects mood. And they think there's a link between this hormone and what? Whose body is really depending on prolactin activity? New moms. What's dopamine also affect? Mood, right? So they think it has a link to postpartum depression. Sure.
Is the prolactin feedback loop, is that also a positive feedback loop?
No, that's actually it's a neural feedback loop. When there's attachment to the nipple, it sends a neural signal up to the hypothalamus, which releases prolactin releasing hormone, which develops milk. Yeah, it's actually an exception to the rule. Detachment. Yeah, it's just like a light switch. When it's a neural loop, it's electrical based again. So flipping off and on is like a light switch instead of being a negative feedback loop. Okay, so feedback by target organ hormones. You already know what happens. The target organ, when it's turned on, if it releases a hormone or does some kind of activity, it'll send a signal all the way back to the brain and tell the brain you did a good job. What part of the brain is it sending the loop back to, by the way? The hypothalamus. Yeah, its primary target is the hypothalamus. It can also be the pituitary, but the primary site is hypothalamus. So here are the 4 types of feedback loops you need to get familiar with. 3 of them are negative feedback loops. The last one's a positive. So when you're drawing these, a long loop negative feedback, the way I remember it is it's a long pathway. It starts in the brain, goes all the way out to somewhere peripherally. Maybe it goes from the brain down to the thyroid. Maybe it goes from the brain all the way to the testis. It's a long loop. The signal starts in the brain, goes down to somewhere out here in the peripheral body, does some physiological effect, the signal comes all the way back up and tells the brain, good job. It's a long loop. A short loop means that it's in the brain, talks to another part of the brain, which comes back and shuts the brain back off. It doesn't actually leave the brain in that situation. An ultra short loop means whatever the gland that's activated is also the gland that shuts itself off. So if you were drawing loops like this, oops, I thought I had a picture of the loop. I'll draw one for you. Oops, did I just turn it off? Nope, just turned it on. Maybe. Yep, there it is. So get used to drawing loops like this. Not every loop has the hypothalamus, by the way, but if you start with the hypothalamus, what's the next organ in line? Pituitary. And then you finally go to whatever the target organ is. So something turns it on. Something initiates it. So stimulus. Turns on the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus turns on the pituitary. The pituitary turns on the target organ and does some physiological effect. If we just plug in some hormones, we're going to keep talking about thyroid hormone over and over again, so we'll choose thyroid hormone. Hypothalamus releases something called TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Goes to the pituitary, releases TSH, which goes down to the target organ, which is what's the target organ in this situation? Thyroid. Right? And by the way, you're trying to bind to a receptor on each one of these. And then the thyroid releases what? Yep, T3 and T4, the thyroid hormones, to do some physiological effect. But those thyroid hormones also travel through the blood. They travel all the way back up to the brain and do what to the pituitary and the hypothalamus? Shut them off. Yep, so they inhibit. That's what the negative sign means, is it inhibits or shuts it off. So let's say the initiating stimulus is low T3 and D4. I'm going to write 99% because the hypothalamus likes everything to be at 100% level. It's like the thermostat in your house. If you set it to 100 degrees, when it turns down to 99 degrees, what happens to the thermostat? The thermostat turns on, sends a signal down to the basement to turn on the what? Furnace. The furnace heats up, sends a signal over to the what? To distribute the heat. Turns on the fan. The fan distributes the heat throughout the house. It comes all the way back up to the initial thermostat and does what to the thermostat once it's at 101%? Shuts it off. That's exactly what happens. Would you describe this as a very short loop or a very long loop? This is a perfect example of a long loop. What kind? Positive or negative feedback? Negative. That's a good example of a long loop negative. An example of a short loop would be that this TSH is traveling the blood. Not all of it binds to the thyroid, so some of it's going to come right back up to the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus to do what? When this gets to 101%. Also tell it to shut off. What kind of loop is that? Is that a really long one? Nope, that's a short one. What kind of short loop? Negative. Yep, initiating stimuli is being low, comes back up and shuts it off. And then ultra short is that TRH will actually come back to the hypothalamus and do what to it? Shut it off. This is an ultra short. So ultra short what? Negative. Those are all negatives. The initiating stimuli turns on this loop. These three things shut it off. When you have enough TRH, enough TSH, enough T3, T, and 4, it shuts those off. Those are all long loop negatives. An example of a long loop positive would be hypothalamus releasing oxytocin. So we'll start with contraction. Uterine contraction. Started it all off. Hypothalamus releases what? Where's oxytocin stored at? It's stored in the posterior pituitary. Is there a hormone that travels from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary? Just oxytocin, but it doesn't travel through the blood. I'm not drawing an arrow for blood here. What am I drawing? So if you really wanted to, you could draw this like a neuron. Yep, and then there's your terminal ending. It's stored there. So contraction sends a signal from her uterus all the way up, a pain signal, right? To the brain and tells the hypothalamus, holy crap, something bad's happening. Oxytocin is actually supposed to be a feel-good chemical. It's released after orgasm, in fact. It's supposed to feel good. Unfortunately, it causes uterine contractions. So, uterine contraction, oops. Here, I'll actually draw a uterus. There's a little fallopian tube. There. Everybody loves visuals, right? So anyway, it sends a signal, oxytocin, to the uterus. The uterus contracts and sends a wired signal all the way back up to the hypothalamus. Not a blood level of oxytocin signal, but an actual wired signal telling it to do what? More. And it keeps doing that over and over and over again until, whoop, baby pops out. And then it stops the loop. Some traumatic event has to stop a positive feedback loop. Otherwise, we just get more and more and more and more intense until she couldn't handle it anymore. So what would that be? Short or long? It's long. Yep, it's long loop, positive. Those are the 4 loops. Right, and then here's how your book draws it. It draws it very linear. When I make the flow charts, I usually like to draw doodle pictures. Who cares if you're not the best artist in the world? When you draw it, you know exactly what it is, and it helps stick in your brain. You have a visual image of things. So I actually like, usually when I make feedback loops, I'll draw the different organs. Like I'll draw the hypothalamus, and I'll draw the thyroid gland, I'll draw the pituitary all in there, showing myself exactly what's happening so I get this visual connection. Alright, so here's why these are important. If there's a tumor in the thyroid gland that's producing thyroid hormone in excess, what would the expected levels of TRH and TSH be based on feedback loops? If there's a tumor in the thyroid gland that's producing lots of thyroid hormone, what would you expect the levels of TRH and TSH to be? How many people think TRH and TSH would be high? How many people think it would be low? How many people think it wouldn't change at all? Wow, that's pretty even split. So, let's go back to the drawing that you just drew if you followed it with me. So here are the hormones again. TRH is up here. TSH is right here. T3 and T4 are down here. They're your 3 major hormones. If you have a tumor here that's cranking out 200% T3 and T4, what's going to happen to the hypothalamus? It shuts off. very strongly shuts off. So what happens to your TRH levels? They go down. If TRH goes down, can the pituitary actually turn on? By the way, that's the anterior pituitary. No. So what's going to happen to your TSH levels? They both drop. You can apply, if you understand that, you can apply that to when somebody goes into, let's say they go into the doctor, and if they're making too much T3 and T4, what symptoms do you think they might have? I already told you what T3 and T4 does. Two simple things. Lifts metabolism and lifts their body temperature. What are two signs they're going to have? They're constantly sweaty and they're also losing lots of weight. They have a huge appetite, but they're gaining no weight. They feel anxious all the time. Is another symptom that we'll talk about later. But they're fidgety, they're anxious, they're on edge, they're losing weight. They eat a lot, but they don't store any fat. They're constantly hot. They walk into a room, and if it seems normal to you, they're like, God, turn the heat down. It's terrible in here. They get that same kind of mood, too. But anyway, so that raises. They take a blood sample, and they go, whoa, your T3 and T4 is through the roof. What's the next hormone they're going to look at? So when they do a blood sample, they're going to look at two hormones. Look at the TSH, right? If their T3 and T4 is high, but their TSH is low, where's the problem? It's the thyroid working without control of TSH. There's something wrong with their thyroid. But what if their T3 and T4 are high and their TSH is high? Where could the problem be? They may have a tumor in the pituitary or the hypothalamus. Yep. So it kind of tells you where things are happening. You can plug in other hormones. You can plug in testosterone. I think in lab we actually talked about this one. But so you can take the hypothalamus that releases G and RH. It goes to the anterior pituitary and releases what two hormones? FSH and LH. FSH did what to the gonads in a man? Produce sperm. What's LH do? Produce testosterone. But if he is taking artificial steroids and he dopes himself with anabolic steroids and takes 200% the normal level, what's the hypothalamus think? Shut off GnRH. If he doesn't have GnRH, what happens to LH and FSH? They both shut off. What happens to his sperm production? What happens to his own natural testosterone production? Drops. What happens to his gonads? They atrophy. So it's kind of fun when you understand the pathways. You can plug any of the hormones that are controlled by a negative feedback loop in there and figure out what's going on. Okay, and you can do the same thing with estrogen. When we get to estrogen, I'll show you menopause, and you can tell if somebody's in real menopause based on certain hormone levels. What's going to happen to estrogen in menopause? It drops. What's the hypothalamus going to think? You need to make more estrogen, so the hormones in this pathway up here are going to do what? Go down or go up? They're both going to spike, but the estrogen is still not made because the ovary is not able to make estrogen anymore. Okay, so like I said, you can either make endocrine system hell or you can have fun with it. I suggest the fun because it's easier to remember when you're having fun with it, whatever you want to call fun. All right, next question or next slide. So this section, we're going to talk about a lot of diseases, and you actually have to know all of these diseases I talked about because some of the diseases will be on the last exam. In fact, your last case studies are all of these diseases. So each group's going to get to pick a different disease, and we're going to talk about them in lab. So the first one's called panhypopituitarism. It's telling you exactly what's happening. Pan means all. So like when you hear about a panacea, it's meaning that it covers all problems. It covers all situations. Even the first continent on the planet was called Pangea. It was one continent. Everything was together. Pan refers to all. Then it tells you the disorder, hypopituitarism. What's it telling you? Low pituitary function. Which hormone is it affecting? Hypopituitarism. What hormone? Because we just talked about 6 anterior pituitary hormones. Which hormone does it affect? All of them. Exactly. Pan is telling you it's all of them. All of them drop. What were they, starting with the flat pig? FSH, LH, ACTH. What was the P? Oh, sorry, I skipped over TH. Thyroid hormone. What was the P? Prolactin and growth hormone. So you shut down all of them. Think about it. The first ones, FSH and LH, what's going to happen to the reproductive function? it's going to decrease. So either they're not going to, if they're children or in puberty, they're not going to develop the reproductive structures. They're going to be what? If you can't reproduce, you're referred to as infertile. Yep. So they've lost those two. What about the A, adrenocorticotropic hormone? What are they not going to be able to deal with very well? Stress, right? They're not going to release cortisol very well. What's interesting is that cortisol raises your blood sugars, so they're actually going to have really low blood sugar all the time, and it's going to make them look like they have what disease? It makes them look like they have diabetes because their blood sugar is not regulated very well. Insulin's not the only hormone that regulates blood sugar. So they're not going to deal with stress very well. Their blood pressure isn't going to work very well because when you are stressed, what happens to your blood pressure? It goes up, partially because of cortisol. If they don't release cortisol, their blood pressure stays low. What's the next one? We covered the FLA, thyroid hormones. What other two symptoms are you going to expect from these people? They're always going to feel tired, they're going to feel cold, and what's going to happen to their weight? They're probably going to be heavier set. And then prolactins, breast development, which you usually don't have to worry about much until reproductive, but same thing. If they're not releasing prolactin, they're not going to be able to do reproductive functions. And then what was the last one? Growth hormone. What would you expect to happen to their height? They would grow slowly, so their height would be stunted. That's panhypopituitarism. Just know all of the hormones and what they do, and anytime you mention a disease, like if I mention hypothyroidism specifically, what's going to be two symptoms right away? Or three. Depression, always feeling cold, and gaining weight. Yep, those are the three classic symptoms of hypothyroidism. You know thyroid hormone. If you have a hypo situation, just turn thyroid hormone down and see the symptoms. If they have hyper, all three of those things go up. They feel anxious instead of depressed. They burn calories really quick, and they always feel hot. So how about this question? A newborn presents with panhypopituitarism. Which of the following symptoms would she most likely have if it's not treated? How about number one? If she has panhypopituitarism, would she have a raised metabolic rate? No, because of what hormone? Not there. She doesn't have thyroid hormone, so her metabolism is going to drop. Number two, will she have gigantism? No, she'll probably have dwarfism, achondroplasia. Yep. Because of what hormone? Growth hormone. It's actually thyroid and growth hormone, but growth hormone is the first one that should probably pop in your mind. And number three, failure of reproductive development and function. Would she have that or not? Yes. FSH, LH, prolactin, those are all important for reproduction. She's decreased in all of them. How about number four? Would she have high blood pressure? No, it would be low because of lack of what hormone? What's the hormone that helps you in a stressful situation to raise your blood pressure and push blood up in the brain? The cortisol, right? So number three is your correct answer. This is the only one that she would likely have. All right, so growth, while we're talking about it, we're going to get it out of the way. Endocrine control of growth, there are two major periods. There's right after birth, so postnatal, for the first 2 years, they grow like a weed. Do they stop growing it too? No, they just slow their growth rate. It's not that they stop growing, it's that they have a rapid growth right after birth, and then they keep growing but more at a slower rate for roughly the next 10 years. And then during puberty, girls around age 11, boys around 13 will get that second growth spurt where they spike up again for the second time. Adolescence and puberty are not the same thing, by the way. Does anybody know the difference? Puberty is a physical change. Puberty represents you going into your reproductive ability. So if a kid goes through a growth spurt, but their reproductive function hasn't changed, technically they're not in puberty. They're just in a growth spurt. Adolescence has everything to do with mental changes. So actually, girl and boy ages for adolescence are very different. For girls, it's more around age 11 to 18, and for boys, it's like 30 to 45. Right? Or 60. There you go. So you can see kind of charting. There's the growth spurt right after birth. Rapid growth until about 2, and then it slows its development, and then poof, 11 to 13, it spikes again. And then up here, you don't grow any taller, you just grow wider. Right? And then factors that affect growth, genetics. You have to have the right, if you want to be 6'5", you have to have the right genes for that. If you have the genes that cause you to be 6'5", that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be that tall, because there are other factors that affect it, like diet. If you don't have the proper diet, the proper nutrients, it doesn't matter how genetically prone you are to be 6 feet or 7 feet tall, you won't hit that mark. All right. Next, freedom from chronic disease. Chronic disease can actually make you overgrow, like gigantism. If you have an endocrine disorder that releases too much growth hormone, too much thyroid, what's going to happen to you? You get what? Gigantism. You're huge. You're tall. But if you don't have those disorders, or if you don't have enough growth hormone or thyroid hormone, what happens to you? You're short. You're a lot smaller. And the same with other diseases. Like you can think of vitamin D. Why do you need vitamin D? To absorb calcium. Why do you need calcium? To develop those bones, to make them straight, strong. And if you don't get that as a child, do you know what the name of the disease is, where your bones start bowing and bending, like especially in the legs? It starts with an R. Rickets. So you have to be free of chronic diseases, not just have the right genetics, not just have the right diet, but also be free of diseases. And then you have to have the right levels of the right hormones at the right times, like thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, if you're hypothyroid as a child, you're going to be short in stature. Insulin helps regulate things like growth hormone. It helps regulate blood sugars, helps regulate fats and amino acids in your blood to help you grow appropriately. So diabetes can actually have an effect on your growth. And then sex hormones, like what are the two major sex hormones? Testosterone and estrogen. Okay, so growth hormone itself, its actions, it's there for promoting growth, obviously. It primarily functions on the soft tissues, which means bone and muscle. I know bone is hard, but it's still considered soft tissue because it's made from cartilaginous cells and osteocytes and osteoblasts that are remodeling it and building it. All right, next you really want to focus on what different hormones do on proteins, fats, and carbs. So you'll see this kind of pattern when we talk about cortisol, when we talk about insulin, when we talk about thyroid hormone, even epinephrine, we'll talk about this. So what are their effects on protein, fats, and carbs in the blood? Remember, your blood's your reference point. So you want to know what the hormone does to the blood levels of proteins, the blood levels of fats, the blood levels of carbs. Growth hormone is going to stimulate protein synthesis. It's going to store protein. Where does it store protein? Where do you store protein? Muscle. So what's it going to do to your blood levels of amino acids and proteins? If it's storing it all in the muscle, what's happening to the levels in the blood? They're going down. So growth hormone will decrease protein in the blood and store it, increase it in the muscle. It decreases it in the blood and stores it in the muscle. And I'm going to stop here for a second and make you think about a feedback loop. If you know a final effect of growth hormone is to lower blood amino acids, what's a stimuli that would release growth hormone? If its final effect is to lower blood amino acids, its initial stimuli was probably having too many amino acids in your blood, like after you just did what? After you ate a big meal with proteins, right? You break them down to amino acids, you bring them into the blood, growth hormone comes out, and then helps you store it as muscle. Right? Its effect on fats. It raises your blood fats. So, in other words, it raises the blood fats by bringing it from where? Where have you been storing the fat? Adipose tissue, right? It's going to break down triglycerides from your adipose tissue, or even in the liver, it stores fats, and dumps it into the blood to raise your blood blood fats. I looked up at carbs right as I was about to say fats. So it lowers amino acids, but it raises fats. Why would it want to raise fat? Why is fat good in your blood? Because it's a good source of energy. Yeah, it's like if you want to build muscle, you have to burn energy to do it. You have to make what? What's the energy? ATP. So you release lots of fats into your blood so that you can turn those fats into ATP and store that muscle. And the same thing with carbohydrates or glucose. When growth hormone comes out, it wants to make energy, so it's going to try and transport the glucose to the blood, doing what to your blood glucose? Will growth hormone raise it or lower it? It's going to raise it, brings it up. It releases sugar from your liver, dumps it into the blood so that it can go to the muscle and build new muscle. So there are your three forms of metabolism that are happening because of growth hormone. lowers blood amino acids to make muscle. It raises blood fat by breaking down adipose tissue. And it raises your blood sugars by releasing glucose from the liver. Okay, and then its effect on bones. It stimulates bone growth at the epiphyseal plates. Couldn't get that out. Until when? When does it stop stimulating the epiphyseal plates? At the end of puberty. At the end of puberty, they seal shut. Then it starts stimulating more of what cells that make bones? What are the cells that make bones? Osteoblasts. Yep. What's it going to do to an osteoclast? The one that destroy bones? Inhibit it. Shut it off. Yep. So again, if you understand what the big picture is, you can put the pieces together. If growth hormone is trying to build bones, it's going to stimulate the bone builders. Anywhere that you build bone at. It's going to shut off the bone destroyers. It's going to raise blood sugar, raise blood fat so you have energy, but it's going to take the amino acids and use them as building blocks to build bone and muscle. Even your bone is built out of proteins. All right, so there's an example. What is, it's labeled, never mind. Hey, look, there's that epiphyseal plate. So the epiphyseal plate stimulated by growth hormone, same with the osteoblasts that are out here along the edge of the compact bone, and it just starts cranking them up. So the epiphyseal plate will actually keep growing higher and higher. I love the way that the bones are built, because the bones, what happens is you build new bone cells right along here, but then as they age, they build new ones above themselves. It's almost like if you were adding a floor onto your house. Here's the roof of the house, here's the first floor. You just kind of lift the roof up and just keep putting bricks in here until the roof gets higher and higher and higher. You don't get a new roof. This doesn't change. You just keep adding between the floors and raising everything. And that's how your bones work until what phase of life that this doesn't do that anymore. The end of puberty. Yep. At the end of puberty, all these cells turn into bone. So they started as cartilage cells, so chondrocytes are the technical name for a cartilage cell, and then they just keep building and building and building. The further they get away from this line of development, the more solid they become, until finally at the end of puberty, all of these solidify. And you can see that on an X-ray. On an X-ray, that line's really dark, and then in an adult, you can't even see the line anymore. All right, the next hormones, somatomedins, they work with growth hormone. They're also known as insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. And there are two types of IGFs. There's IGF-1. This stimulates that linear bone growth. It goes to the epiphyseal plate and stimulates to grow taller and taller and taller. IGF-2, we don't really know what it does after you're born, but during fetal development, it actually helps you to build the bones. It takes the cartilage that you had and turns it, or solidifies it, or ossifies it into bone. So if you've ever seen images of like a fetus and you can see it almost looks like the skeleton's glass, it's because it's made out of what? What's the connective tissue in your body that looks like glass? Man, I wish somebody could remember the exact name of it. It starts with an H. Nobody remembers. It's called hyaline cartilage. It means glass cartilage. Your bones as a fetus, you have hyaline cartilage everywhere. You have squishy cartilage as bones, and then when IGF-2 comes along, it starts turning that bone, or that cartilage, into bone. So you get bone towers and thickening of the bone. All right, so what causes growth hormone to be released? Well, first you want to go, what's the gland growth hormone's made in first? Growth hormone. If you ever forget, what's the first letter of it? G. What's it fit into? Flat pig, right? The FLATPG. So growth hormone's the G in flat pig. Where's it made at then? In the anterior pituitary. What controls the anterior pituitary? The hypothalamus. So first you have to make sure you know what hormones stimulate the release of growth hormone. It's an indirect effect. It's not just because you have high amino acids that growth hormone is dumped out. It's because the hypothalamus detects the high levels of amino acids. And then it releases what? Growth hormone releasing or growth hormone inhibiting? High amino acids causes the release of growth hormone releasing hormone. So low amino acids would probably stimulate the release of which of these? Growth hormone inhibiting, which is also known as somatostatin. Right? These are the two hormones that come from the hypothalamus that affect the anterior pituitary to release or inhibit the release of growth hormone. So if you're plugging in a loop like this, there's your anterior pituitary with growth hormone coming out of it. Here's your hypothalamus with its hormones that are coming out. Remember, GH, IH is the same as SS, which is somatostatin. Right? Here are your effects of growth hormone. Goes to the liver and releases the somatomedins. Goes to all the other cells like soft tissues, bones, muscles, etc. And increases metabolic effects. And then you want to put above the hypothalamus the things that stimulate the release. What did I say about amino acids? High or low stimulate the release? High or low amino acids? High amino acids, because what's the final effect of growth hormone? To store the amino acids is muscle. Yep. So up here you could probably put high amino acids with an arrow that does what? Positive or negative to the hypothalamus? Positive. It excites it, right? What about blood sugar? What does growth hormone do to blood sugar? It raises it, so why might growth hormone come out if you have low blood sugar? What about blood fats? What does growth hormone do to the blood fats? It raises it for energy, so why might growth hormone come out if you have low blood fats, low blood lipids? What's a stage of life that's going to excite the hypothalamus and make it release growth hormone? Puberty. Yep. Here's another one. What would stimulate you to build muscle? What could you do, hopefully 5 days a week, that could stimulate muscle development? Exercise increases growth hormone release. By the way, exercise damages muscles and raises blood amino acids. Exercise also burns sugar from your blood, so both of those are actually connected. And the last one you definitely want to have down here is that what do you do every night that releases growth hormone? Sleep. Sleep releases growth hormone. Shaquille O'Neal was asked one time why they thought he was so big, and he said, because I sleep a lot. And I don't know if he was kidding or if he was serious, but sleep actually increases growth. All right, so how you regulate it? Of course, the negative feedback loops, we went over things like the levels of blood sugar, blood fats, blood amino acids. All right? Sleeping is another stimuli. So about an hour after falling asleep, your growth hormone spikes. Hypoglycemia, I already talked about, so low blood sugar, like after you exercise or in stressful situations, growth hormone comes out to raise your blood sugar. Having too many amino acids in your blood, and then having a loss of free fats in the blood. So all these things I already listed off. So which one is not a function of growth hormone? What's one thing that growth hormone does not do? Which is not a function of growth hormone? All right, how about number one? Does it increase muscle mass? Yep. Does it increase plasma glucose? Yep. Does it increase adipose tissue? Nope. It does what to adipose tissue? It breaks it down to push the fat into the blood. And then, of course, it does stimulate bone growth. So the only thing it doesn't do is increase adipose tissue. It decreases it. So however you want to draw the loops, you can draw it like I have in your notes, or like it was on 2 slides back. Or you can make it more complex like this, where you can see all these things that are coming in and stimulating the hypothalamus and causing it to release growth hormone. So however you want to do it, you can do it your own way. Whatever works best for you, in other words. Okay, so now the disease. And after I talk about each of the hormones, I'll talk about the disease that's associated with the hormone. This one can go either way, right? You can have too much growth hormone or you can have too little. If you have too much growth hormone, what happens to you? Gigantism. You grow bigger than normal. Gigantism, by the way, happens before puberty. At the end of puberty, you don't become a giant. So if you get a tumor after puberty that releases lots of growth hormone, you don't become a giant. Instead, you actually get another disease, which I think is in here. Yeah, it's acromegaly. There it is. So excess causes gigantism if it's in children or during puberty. But after puberty, your bones can't get any taller, but they can still grow. They start growing what? Wider. They get thicker. So things like flat bones start thickening up. Where do you find a lot of flat bones? The skull, right? So is there a lot of room for the skull to thicken and squeeze in? Nope. So it can start compressing the brain and cause problems. The frontal, up here, the frontal bone usually starts projecting outward, so they get more of that Cro-Magnon kind of look. And the same thing with the jaw, it starts jutting forward. Anybody know who Jaws is from the James Bond movies? he was Happy Gilmore's boss. They got the nail stuck in his head, but had that big bulky jaw, kind of like this, very broad, thick forehead. So he probably got a tumor or developed too much growth hormone somewhere in puberty, but kept developing it afterwards, and the bones just keep thickening and getting thicker. Even their hands get huge. This guy, I always thought he looked normal until I looked at his height. I mean, he's like 5'7" with the toupee, but his head is his jaw is enormous, his forehead's enormous compared to the rest of his body. And you can see hands compared to a normal hand. So those are too much growth hormone. What about insufficient growth hormone? While you're a child, what's it cause? Dwarfism. Achondroplasia is the technical name. Is that in the notes? Nope. So achondroplasia, it's spelled ACHONDRAPLASIA. A means what in medicine? Without. Chondro means cartilage. Plasia means growth. Without cartilage growth. Achondroplasia. There are like 200 and some different types of achondroplasia. Lots of causes, lots of problems. And then in adults, when you don't have enough growth hormone, really there aren't that many symptoms. You don't shrink because of lack of growth hormone, but your muscle mass will do what? That will shrink. Your bone density might start thinning, right? Because growth hormone also stimulates the development of muscle and bone, soft tissues, but not necessarily growing bigger after puberty, but at least keeping them maintained. That's why as we hit like our 40s, actually at the age of 30, your growth hormone starts decreasing. What happens to your muscle mass after 30? Starts decreasing with it. So these two kids are the same age. These two kids are the same age. These two kids are the same age. Kidding. Totally kidding. This one has gigantism, and there's a normal-sized boy. This guy was the tallest man in the world from Ukraine. He said that his height was a curse from God. God must hate him because it took him like 3 or 4 months just to be able to afford a pair of shoes because his shoes were so big. This one was photoshopped in 1832. Think about that. Okay. And then there's an example of acromegaly. And then here's a woman. This is kind of interesting because you can see her different ages. So she was normal through puberty, and then after puberty, look what started happening to her jaw, her forehead, her hands. What disease does she have? Acromegaly. Yeah. Okay, and it's not just growth hormone or somatomedins that actually control growth. There are other hormones that are necessary, like thyroid hormone is necessary. We'll talk about disease. If you're a child and you have hypothyroidism, it severely affects your growth. Thyroid is a permissive hormone. What's that tell you? Permissive, if you have lab, sorry, if you haven't had lab, I guess you don't know. Permissive means it permits another hormone to work. Thyroid hormone allows growth hormone to work. You can have normal growth hormone, but if you're lacking thyroid hormone, your growth hormone doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So you get all the symptoms of having a growth hormone deficiency. Thyroid hormone is also important for neurological development. It helps develop the brain. So if you're a child and you're lacking thyroid, your brain doesn't develop appropriately. It causes mental retardation. So thyroid's equally important in growth, just like growth hormone is. And then insulin actually works with growth hormone because it increases protein synthesis. It helps build muscle because it likes to store things. Insulin loves to store sugar, it loves to store amino acids, it loves to store fats. It stores these things away for later. It works with growth hormone in storing proteins, but it works against hormone and sugar and fats. Right? Growth hormone makes you spike your blood sugar. What's insulin make you do? Lower your blood sugar. Yep. Growth hormone makes you raise your blood lipids. Insulin makes you lower your blood lipids. But insulin's important for growth and development. And then the androgens and estrogens. What's the major androgen? Testosterone. There's actually another one called DHEA that's more powerful in women for growth than it is in men because we have testosterone. We don't need this other DHEA so much. Right? And then I already talked about this, but it stimulates protein synthesis. You know this. Anabolic steroids are fake testosterone. They build muscle growth. They build bone growth, make it dense. They also increase masculine features, which are just a side effect. Release lots of oils from the skin, cause rage, make the junk shrink. Right? So that's growth. Right, next is the posterior pituitary, and there are only 2 hormones you have to worry about here. We'll go back and cover some of the other things like the thyroid hormone stuff when we get to the periphery. Because thyroid's big effect is actually in the peripheral system, not in the central nervous system. All right, so the posterior hormones derived embryologically from neural tissue. That's why they call the posterior pituitary the neurohypophysis. Hypophysis is the term pituitary. It's the other name for pituitary. Adeno was the anterior because it's made of epithelial tissue from the Rathke's pouch. Neuro is from the brain. So this one grows down out of the brain and connects up with the anterior pituitary. But this is a neural connection, so we call it neurohypophysis. Right, hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary form a neurosecretory system. The cell bodies are in the hypothalamus, and what is in the posterior pituitary? What part of the neuron? The body's up here. You have a long axon that comes down, and what's the ending called that's in the posterior pituitary? The terminal, or where the synapse would be. The terminals, the knobs, the boutons, whatever you want to call it. Right? So the hypothalamus makes it and then just stores the hormones in the posterior pituitary. And the two are the vasopressin and oxytocin. We already talked about where they came from. Which one releases oxytocin, or makes oxytocin? Was it the S or the P? It was the P, right? O and P stand together. So the paraventricular nuclei make oxytocin. The supraoptic make the vasopressin. What's the other name for vasopressin? ADH. I keep pulling all these things out. Even though you had to know ADH for the last test, it's a hormone, so you have to know it for the final test. Right, the name of the cells are pituocytes, and the pituocytes are technically actually like glial cells. What's a glial cell? Wow, this is going back to the second week of class. Told you can't forget things, they keep coming back. Glial cells are not neurons, they're the supporting cells, right? So they're supporting cells in the brain. The pituocytes are the supporting cells that help nurture and feed and regulate things that are happening around these neurons. They're supporting cells. They're a type of glial cell. They don't make the hormones. They don't release the hormones. They just take care of the hormone-producing cells. All right, and then the posterior pituitary doesn't actually make any hormones. It just stores them. What property do all of these hormones have? Do you remember what I told you 30 minutes ago? They're all peptide proteins. Yep. So do they like water or dislike water? They love it. Do they travel easily through the blood? Absolutely. What organ usually has to clear them? The liver. Yep. So they're either inactivated by the target that they hit when they bind to a receptor that gets shut off, or the liver, because they're water-loving. They don't easily get peed out. Right, so here's the pathway. Again, you already saw this picture. There's the cell body up in the hypothalamus. Here's the axon that transports the neurotransmitter down and stores it in the terminal. The terminal actually sits in the posterior pituitary, and when the hypothalamus is ready to release it, an action potential comes shooting down here and then opens up those vesicles and dumps them, just like you learned back in the nervous system. It dumps all that hormone out into the blood, and then the blood travels all over the body, carrying those wherever they need to go. Where's the main target of vasopressin? There are actually two organs. What's one of them? One is the kidney. It helps you retain water. What's the vasopressin telling you it's doing? Blood vessels. Yep, it's causing the blood vessels to do what? Dilate or constrict? Constrict. And then oxytocin goes to what organ primarily? The uterus. Yep. There's a secondary organ it goes to. It's the breast tissue. Remember, prolactin produces milk. Guess what oxytocin does? Releases milk. Yep. So that's why they say that when a woman's breastfeeding, she releases oxytocin to release the breast milk, but is oxytocin just going to the breast? It's also going to her uterus and causing it to do what? Contract. Why would that be good after birth? It's trying to shrink the uterus back down to size. That's another reason that breastfeeding is really important. Is for the mom, not just for the baby, is because that oxytocin causes the uterus to shrink back down to its close to normal size. All right, so which one's false about the posterior pituitary? How about the posterior pituitary? I'll let you look for it. All right. So which one is false? You're looking for something that's not true. So number one, the posterior pituitary stores ACTH. False. That one's false. What does it store? a DH, which is also known as vasopressin. So let's see, number 2. There's a neurological connection between the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. Is that true? Absolutely. It's called the neurohypophyseal connection. And then number 3, the hypothalamus makes oxytocin and ADH. That one's a T for true. Number 4, hormones released from the posterior pituitary are released into the blood. True. It's a hormone. Where does it get released to? The blood. It doesn't matter what the name of the hormone is. If it's a hormone, it's released into the blood. So you've got an F by number 1, and then the other 3 are T's, so you know that 1's the right answer. All right, what you need to remember or know about vasopressin or ADH is, number 1, is it enhances retention or reabsorption of water at the kidneys. What part of the kidneys? Bowman's capsule, proximal tubule, acinnulum, decinnulum, distal tubule, or collecting duct? Distal tubule and collecting duct. It binds to a receptor and does what? Opens holes for what? Water. What's the one that turns on sodium? Aldosterone. Yep. The one that turns on sodium pumps is aldosterone. So remember, ADH, vasopressin, affects water. And it also constricts arterial smooth muscle, causing vasoconstriction. Yep. That's what vasopressin, vessel pressure, ADH, antidiuretic. Tells you the kidney and the blood vessels. All right, how it's released. Vasopressin is released because of the hypothalamic osmoreceptors. This is not necessarily a feedback loop. Actually, it is, but it's a neural feedback loop. So in this situation, the osmoreceptors are saying what? Why would they want to release ADH? To make you do what? Retain water, so what's the osmoreceptor detecting? There's low water, right? Either there's too much solute or there's too little water. That would be what? Hypo or hypertonic? Hypertonic, right? Hyper means too much solute, which means too little water. So hypothalamic osmoreceptors are turned on during a hypertonic blood situation. So you ate too much salt, you peed out too much water already, something caused the water level to drop or your solutes to go up. And then a minor input from baroreceptors. Where are the baroreceptors? Carotid. Yep, so the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. Why would they turn on? Why would they tell the hypothalamus to turn on if your blood pressure is low? And it releases vasopressin, which constricts the blood vessels to raise it, but it also releases it as ADH, which does what to the kidney? Retains water that raises your blood volume, right? Raising your blood pressure. So you already knew these things, you just have to remember again. Now the deficiencies. ADH deficiency is called diabetes insipidus. So can you get away with just saying it's diabetes? No, because it's absolutely, positively, very, very different than diabetes mellitus. They only have one symptom in common. Guess what? They make you do what a lot? Pee a lot. Yeah, if you have ADH deficiency, you're not releasing ADH, which means that you can't retain water, which means you lose lots of water. What's the substance that can actually cause ADH deficiency if you're drinking too much of it? Ethanol. Drinking too much alcohol on Friday or Saturday night. I'm just assuming you only do it on Friday and Saturday nights, right? So anyway, you have acute diabetes insipidus on Friday and Saturday night when you drink too much alcohol and you pee all that water out. So what kind of diuresis would you have? Would you have osmotic diuresis or water diuresis? Water diuresis. What would your urine look like when you have diabetes insipidus? Very clear, with very little color to it. And then ADH excess, they couldn't come up with something more creative, so they just called it syndrome of inappropriate ADH. It's called SIADH. Here you release way too much ADH. What's going to be your problem? You retain way too much water. What are your symptoms going to be? You're going to feel bloaty. Your blood volume is going to go up, which means what else is going to go up? Your blood pressure is going to go up. Exactly. You're going to dilute all your cells. What situation do you get into? A hyper or hypotonic situation? Hypotonic. You have way too much water in your blood. Where does that water go? Does it stay in the plasma? Nope, it shifts into the interstitial fluid. So what symptom might you get when you get too much water in your interstitial fluid? What's swelling of the tissues called? Edema, yep. So you get a lot of edema, and if you work all day, where's that edema start showing up? Around your feet, get swollen. And then that water moves into the cells and it causes the cells to swell, and unfortunately it can actually cause some metabolic issues. So too little or too much ADH can be a problem. And then the last hormone today is oxytocin. Oxytocin they call the cuddle chemical because if you ever do any psychology research, they call it the cuddle chemical because animals that have a lot of oxytocin bond very well. There's a study, if you ever get a chance, they're called prairie voles, where prairie voles have really high levels of oxytocin naturally, and they bond. They mate for life. They find a mate, they bind to that mate, and they stay with that mate until they're both dead. And then another thing is that when they have pups, you can take the mom and the pups and put them in a cage, and if you pick up mom, all the pups cling on to mom for dear life. They don't let go. They're like all stuck to the mom, and the mom's trying to hold all of them at the same time. They bond really tightly when they have high oxytocin. But if you give the mom a chemical that lowers her oxytocin, she wants nothing to do with the pups. If you put them together, she'll run to the opposite side of the cage, and if the pups chase after her, she'll keep running around and trying to get away from it. They're actually doing research in Europe where they're prescribing this. Psychiatrists are prescribing it for what issues? Relationship issues. Yeah, they're prescribing it so that it's trying to get bonding. Women release a lot of oxytocin after an orgasm, which makes them want to what? Cuddle. We release vasopressin, which makes us retain a lot of water and have to go pee, right? Or whatever. I already talked about vasopressin and memory. But oxytocin is the cuddle chemical because of that. It's released after orgasm. It's released during when? What do you already know about it? We mentioned it earlier. Childbirth. It's released during childbirth to cause uterine contractions. It's also released after childbirth when she does what? Breastfeeding. So 3 major times in a woman's life when she's releasing lots of oxytocin: during breastfeeding, during birth, and after orgasm. And they do the same things. They give, think about it. Mom just squeezed this thing that's like the size of Mount Everest through a valley, a little tiny valley. Right? The worst pain she will ever experience in her life. What does your gut instinct say she wants to do this thing that caused all this pain? Neglect to kill it. I was not thinking that extreme, but I like how that popped out faster than I could finish. Kill it! But instead, because of these high levels of oxytocin, what does she want to do? Give me the baby! Right? She wants to take the baby, and naturally they want her to breastfeed, pretty soon afterwards, and it increases oxytocin level, that bonding between mom and baby. So, and then they'll keep releasing during breastfeeding too. What's interesting is that high levels of oxytocin that are consistent actually act as a contraceptive. So high levels of oxytocin and prolactin consistently prevent her from being able to release another egg. So if she breastfeeds roughly every 2.5 hours, it actually works mostly as a natural contraceptive. Is that perfect? Neither is the pill, right? So accidents happen. The worst thing is that if she sleeps through the night, that's like 8 hours without the release of this contraceptive. So, oops, an egg can be released, and if she goes back to breastfeeding every 2.5 hours, it's too late now. She's triggered that release. All right, secretion of oxytocin by reflexes that originate in the birth canal. So those initial uterine contractions send a signal to the brain, to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has already made the hormone. It's already stored in the posterior pituitary, so now the hypothalamus just fires an action potential that dumps the hormone into the blood, and it travels down to the uterus, causing another contraction. Another stimulus is when the infant suckles on the breast, so attachment to the nipple. Another stimulus is actually crying. If she hears the baby crying, what starts happening? She starts leaking, lactating. So all these are neural stimuli. Either the pain sensation from the uterine pathway, the stimuli from the areolar, or hearing a baby cry. All of them are neural. And that's all we have for the central. And we have just a few minutes left, so we have just enough time to take a urinalysis quiz, and then we'll get out of here. So put everything away except your little portfolio for a lab.